Alrighty, so, um, give, I guess, how do I start? I can start it. It's not gonna be the best, but I'll start it. Hello, good morning to everyone that's shown up and whatnot. This is Digger, and welcome to the OSS's Breakfast Chatter for the FFTCG podcast for episode 1. Um, so I guess for intros for those of us that are in the podcast here, we'll each say where we're from and whatnot, what decks we play, and so on. So I guess I'll start with that. um, so I'm a Canadian player. Whether or not you've heard of my online alias is eh. The deck I tend to play is a summon theme deck, which is either I cast my summons for free or I still cast them for cheaper and still get more value back if I can, and still be more aggressive in destroying what you have on the field, so I can still come in for game. Um, how I got into the game is generally picked up a couple of packs randomly at the local shop, my local shop, and it kind of snowballed from there. Alright, so I kind of did my thing. Meepo, do you want to say which is yours?
Yeah, definitely. Meeple here. I'm from Eastern Canada, St. John's, Newfoundland, on the very far east of Canada. I got into this game. I got into this game roughly when Opus 4 was out and Opus 5 was around the corner. Um, I currently have, geez, I must have 10 or 11 different decks at the moment. I have no particular deck I favor towards, but I've been playing a little bit of everything. Right now, the biggest deck I'm probably working on is something with Laswell and Knights. I tried Ice Lightning, Ice Earth, and now I'm working on something with Ice Water. Just constantly testing it out on a daily basis. And every Thursday when I get together with my friends, usually try to test it out there. Um, but yeah, I basically quit Yu-Gi-Oh! Two separate times, and the final time I did quit, I'm like, that's it. I'm done with card games. And then not even a month later, a friend's like, Final Fantasy's making a card game, right? And I'm like, I'm in. I'm sold.
Alright, so thanks for the intro there, Meepo. Do you want to start with yourself there, Quinn?
Yeah, sure. Hello, my name is Quinn. I'm an American player. I particularly started with, I guess I would say,
You're best
like
speaking a little
the
bit.
more traditional card games here in the States, like, for example, Magic the Gathering. So I do have a Magic the Gathering background. I guess my introductory into Final Fantasy came about through a friend that kind of just showed up at my house with some starter decks that they picked up at PAX, which is a fairly big convention here in the States. Um, that being the case, because I have like a stronger Magic background, Final Fantasy plays very similarly to Magic the Gathering. I would almost say like it's a little more, um, how do I want to say, detailed of a game. Like it's more involved sometimes than Magic the Gathering. So rightfully so, I found that very interesting. Um, Particularly when it comes to deck archetypes that I play, I'm primarily a wind or water player. Those are just the elements that I find at or find myself being the most interested in, design space wise. Um, However, I do recently, in order to kind of diversify my portfolio, I've been playing a lot more earth and or ice decks. I do find them like harder to pilot. I'm not sure if that's just because of the card pool that they have, or maybe just like the types of Ice Earth decks that I'm playing. But I primarily would say I'm pretty much a control player. So yeah, that hopefully sums up my introductory and the types of stuff that I like.
Alright, thanks for that.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yuki, do you want to chime in of your intro there? Well, thanks for the intro there, Yuki. Um, we'll probably just start off with, I guess, yeah. So we'll start off with the how do uh, what type of locals, what do the locals in our each of our respected areas tend to play, what the popular deck is, what the local meta is, and so on. I can talk about my and Yuki's for lack of a better term of it. um,
Yeah.
Basically, it flip flops between Chocobo, Summon, or Dragoon. Between the two of that are generally there. And actually, from there, oddly enough, Bahamut's been picking up as well.
Hmm. Do you mind for those who might know or not know, do you mind maybe explaining what those decks particularly like to do, like how they particularly operate and what piloting them is like?
Yeah, I can elaborate on that. For I guess I'll go with the summons because I'm there. Summons are either using a particular card that a bunch of the players that are here like to use is the forward Minwu, from set six legendary, which is this cast when he attacks, cast a 4-drop summon or less from hand without paying an actual cost before his attack resolves all that other jazz. So a lot of it is to either there's like an ice variant, there's a lightning variant, there's a fire variant, or even a wind variant, kind of diversifies, but it always revolves around the water being part of it. So it's just a lot of that shenanigan. Chocobos is a glass can that goes quick, quick, and kicks you in the face. Then Dragoons is, this swarm board, get big and start beating face. They're a little bit more of a sturdy glass cannon than Chocobos, but they still are kind of a glass cannon if you take out a couple of the key cards. And I think Yuki is going to chime in for the Bahamut part of it.
Okay, so I'm assuming by what you're iterating is like it's a heavy removal deck.
Yeah, that's pretty. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
So from there, Quinn, would you like to talk about your own?
Yeah, sure. So here in the States, especially particularly in my area, there are quite a few locals. I'd say almost four or five of them. So the diversity of play is pretty much, it's there like any other locals. You get to your aggro players. So like decks like, dragoons, like you were saying, or much more like high rolly, like you want to kill your opponent by turn 3 or 4 kind of decks. But they primarily don't top any of the tournaments here. um, what I would say, primarily does top and sees quite a bit of play are decks like Soray members. And for those who don't know what Soray is, they're kind of a tribal deck. Not kind of, but they are a tribal deck that utilizes devotion, kind of like magic, to make sure that their field has a specific amount of Soray members and they get abilities for having those Soray members. And if you set the deck up correctly, you're looking at playing multi-element forwards that are fairly strong, fairly cheaply costed in the consideration of like how they're played. um, So that usually is seen maybe I would say the most. The second most deck that I would say is primarily kind of summons oriented. So they're I would say mono water summons and or mono fire summons. So kind of like Yuki was saying, um, they're primarily what I would call like very aggressive style decks that utilize summons to kind of accrue value that normally wouldn't be caught in like standard construction of Final Fantasy. So they're unique in that kind of format. If I were to say like or pick a third kind of deck, much more slow but does see quite a bit of play are these like earth ice slash wind water decks. They're much more mid range. Their purpose is to like kind of create board states that accrue so much value that your opponent basically kind of gets starved for turns where honestly there's too many options to deal with. So they kind of just kind of roll over and die. Those decks, they are much slower, so they don't see as much frequency here in the States, but they do show up quite a bit. So yeah, pretty competitive scene around here in the States, I would say.
Yeah, certainly. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, there's no local scene tournament-wise here. Of course, as many places across the country, like all that kind of stuff, like pandemic really hit us pretty hard in that regard. However, I am happy to say though that the community is slowly building back up. A lot of existing players are coming back, and even better, we have some new players, people that I know that I used to play Yu-Gi-Oh with, are also coming back, getting into the game, and they're absolutely loving it. So I wouldn't say there's no specific deck that's running around because we meet together every Thursday at a friend's house and we just play a variety of decks. Um, and that's kind of the fun part about it. Nothing really big like high tier decks or meta decks are being played that much, but like everyone's just honestly playing what they enjoy, experimenting with what they got. For example, one of my friends right now, he's fully got the Black Waltz deck made, and that's some pretty cool stuff. Another person who's a huge Final Fantasy IV fan, he just went all in on the game, and now he's got himself a really cool Category 4 deck. Um, More so emphasizing on Opus 13, Golbez Legend, and all those heroic archfiends from that set. Um, I myself, two of the biggest decks I'm playing right now is, like I said before, something ice something deck with Laswell, Agrius, and Ramza, and all those new cards, which is pretty fun. Including myself, I finally have a Marzi Soiree deck made, and that's pretty fun too. What I usually try to do is like build something that's similar to what I see going around, but try to add my own little flavor net to it. Other than that, another big deck I see going around, which is pretty cool. A friend of mine has made a Wind, Fire, Rebel, Warrior deck using all those Category 2 cards like Leon, Guy, Furion, and Maria, and all that stuff. So that's a pretty cool deck too. Lastly, another player is basically invested in the Shinra Avalanche dual deck that came out, which is a pretty good deck in its own right. So she's basically um, playing a lot lately, a lot of Turks deck with um, Ice and Lightning, yeah. So nothing really specific to zero in on. It's just honestly right now we just always got a nice bit of variety. Some of the existing players that finally came back, they never had a chance to get their hands on yet on like Opus 13 onward, but they're already starting to make some pretty cool decks. Like I think there's been some buzz going around. Someone wants to make Pollen Porn deck that's been going around, and other than that, yeah, a little bit of variety going on here.
All right. So from there, I guess I'll bring up the topic, which is almost everyone's kind of a buzz about in some way or another. Oh my God, excuse me. It's probably the recent ban and or in different formats and the new addition to the watch list, I guess. It's we can
Yeah.
just talk, we can just touch on that and whatnot because everyone's been
Sure.
a buzz about it anyway, so it's kind of hard not
Do you
to
want to
escape that.
do you,
It's definitely
do you
worth
want
talking about.
Yeah.
yeah, do you guys want to explain maybe to those who don't know what the watch list is?
So, other than the ban list, the watch list is basically the same thing, but it's cards that they deem they have to keep an eye on just in case it gets a little bit too oppressive of use. So, that way, like previously before the new ban list, which we'll get into that in a second, there was a card on there that went from the watch list to the ban list. So it's usually cards that are usually kept an eye on and are in line to be banned at some point or another relatively soon within the year or two. So
Hmm.
that's how that's how I particularly view it, but some people may view it otherwise, but so
No, I think you got it on the point there. It's basically cards that are making a huge splash in the game and having a profound effect on the game. And I even agree with the list. Like, there's definitely some cards on there where I'm like, that's a fair point. I can understand why that card's on there.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think their intended purpose specifically for the list was to curb gameplay, specifically because Final Fantasy is unlike Magic the Gathering that has alternate win cons. A lot of the value does come from forward-based like win cons. So smacking your opponent for the 7 damage to win. But some of those cards that are on the list specifically abuse fundamentals of the game and change how they particularly work. So, for example, one of the more notorious cards was a forward by the name of Stern Leonis um, that changed, particularly during that opus, how deck construction was actually utilized. Because for those of you who don't know, the game operates basically by setting things like backups and forwards in order to accrue value, remove other forwards, and thus defeat your opponent. But decks that ran around Stern Leonis could almost avoid backups entirely to specifically just run forwards, and they were very, very aggressive and very hard to deal with. So rightfully so, that card made its way to the ban list. So primarily, that list exists primarily to curb that kind of gameplay.
yeah, and it's not that Stern. I don't think that Stern is outright banned. Like he is in
Standard
standard, but
format.
I'm not sure if he's banned in title format yet.
Um,
You know that.
I
Yep,
could be
that's a
wrong.
good
I could
point.
be wrong, but maybe he's still playable. Correct me if I'm wrong. In either L6 format or L3 format. I think.
I'm not entirely sure. I do know that for those of you who play the All Star Cube, he's completely legal within that set. But that's a singleton format, so the ban list doesn't encompass all formats, but it does encompass standard, which is primarily the majority of where people find themselves playing.
Yeah. So and then going come into this current updated ban list. Um,
Hmm.
when I mentioned there was a card that was on the watch list that made it to the ban list recently was Macherie, which was pretty much the counterpart to
Hmm.
Stern at that point.
Yeah.
When they're
Do you
both
want to
released.
explain how she works?
Yeah. So Macherie, in a sense, works similar to Stern, but is really only based around the summon cards. Where Stern was based around forwards, Macherie was based around summons. Via
Sure.
lore, it makes sense if you play the games.
Summons, and forwards that were in the break zone specifically.
Yeah. So, uh, Macherie makes summons cost one less passively. She's a 2-cost forward with 6k power.
Light.
Yeah, light. Um, Now, you can remove 3 summons, even just when you play her the first turn. You can remove 3 summons from the break zone, do one of the 3 actions. One is draw a card, one is bounce a forward, doesn't indicate your opponent's yours, and one is make a summon cost 3 or less, can't become 0. For the most part,
Hmm.
though, um, most people either get the value of draw, or they bounce her back to hand or whatever back to hand and just replay it otherwise. So,
So, do
sorry.
you want to explain why that particularly is powerful?
Well, I can say my bit from for starters. The draw, especially if you're running a summon heavy deck, kind of like IE me. um, so if you're running a summon heavy deck, it has a lot of value. Like you have like almost a small little toolkit that gives you an advantage almost right off the bat. Like if you get her turn one when you on your first turn, and you get things out, you now have a toolkit to get advantage for the next turn or the turn after. It's like either gives you an extra draw or bounces something back to hand, and it's going to be a little bit longer of a pace to try to get around her. And usually people are a little scared of her, and for obvious reasons, to deal with her, so they have to kind of waste more resources to get her out of the game permanently or otherwise than you've just spent to get her in.
Yeah, every time I've ever played against her, I'm kind of like, okay, now I'm in rush mode. Like I have to find a way to get rid of her fast. And when I do get rid of her, she's like, oh, that's okay, that's cool. I'm just gonna draw some cards before you get rid of me, or even like what you said before, I'm just gonna send myself back in the hand, so you can't get rid of me.
Hmm. So, how would you say that particularly differs from, the standardized construction of decks? How do you think she changes that?
For me, I see that as something along the lines of, well, similar to Stern, but where people were primarily building around the forwards or otherwise because of Stern. Since Stern was banned and people found more use out of Mastery, because for a while, summon themed decks was good, but it was still a niche, and then it just picked up and just kept on going at like without the brakes on a railway track. So like, oh boy. Which I'm happy about, but sad about at the same time personally. But um, it it
No,
it
that's an interesting perspective. What makes you sad about it?
um, well, for me, it's just like, hey, finally, my theme deck is no longer just a niche, maybe mid tier two jank deck. It's now bottom tier one to borderline tier zero, depending on which build does what. And I'm like, yay, my deck game was time to shine is now, but it's due to a oppressive card that no one likes.
Yeah, I kind of felt that a little bit when I used Stern Leonis. There was a point in time where I had him maybe in a mono lightning deck, and I was like I said, like what you're saying, like he has some cool abilities. He really gave that deck that edge, but I also understood at the same time like he is like he's a crazy card to use and all that kind of stuff. He's pretty oppressive and all that kind of sense. So when he got banned as well, I'm like, oh, that's a bummer, but I totally get it.
Hmm.
Meepo, do you want to explain for those of our listeners who do not know who or what Stern Leonis does? Do you want to explain his abilities?
Yes, certainly. In fact, what I'll even do is just quickly pop it up here on FF Decks. Similar to Mashere, but with forwards. Basically, Stern Leonis' first effect is the cost required to cast your forwards reduced by 1, can't become 0. And he has similar abilities, remove four forwards from your break zone from the game, and you can select one of the 3 following actions. Choose a forward, deal 7k damage. Choose a monster, break it, or until the end of the turn, all the forwards you control gain 4,000 power and brave. He's a 4 CP dark forward with power with 9,000 power.
Hmm.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
I'll like to point out as well, the two cards that we mentioned that are banned in standard format, they are not the highest rarity cards. They're the second highest rarity, but still they are a little bit easier to obtain in the set that they were released in, which is a lot better, but a lot worse at the same time during.
That's right.
So it's
Hmm. No, that's interesting that you feel kind of sad that Mashiri had to go. Likewise, I can understand why people particularly did not um, feel strongly towards her. However, do you, particularly when it comes to like tournament play. Would you say by banning her, it maybe changed how deck construction is going to work? Do you think it made an impact at all? How do you feel about it?
Me personally, I think it did or will change it a little bit, at least enough because
Hmm.
it doesn't give a lot more value like the Leviathan Bismarck deck. It doesn't give more value to it than uh, because that deck with Moshri just is like, well, I'm not doing anything right now. I'm just going to sit here twiddling my thumbs and just play this out because this is like, yeah. It's like, oh, I
Yeah.
do
Hmm.
something, they lay something down. It's like, well, I'm not playing the game. Do 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 do.
Yeah. So on a casual sense, you would say that card is miserable to play against. But
Yeah.
on a on a competitive sense, would you say it was the most represented deck though?
Mm, it was within the top decks, that's for sure. That I could see. Like Moshri is dealable, you can deal with her, but like I mentioned and whatnot, you have to kind of overcost to deal with her a lot of times, and it's just like, so
Hmm.
it's on a competitive level. There are a couple of outs. Like obviously, there's like the build the mirror deck to deal with her before your opponent does. Pray to God you RNGesus the draw, and like, hey, cool, I'm just going to get the advantage this turn, have fun. Or you are able to build the counter deck to it, which are in any card game. There's a lot of counter decks to the meta. So
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, like for example, in your locals particularly, would you have said that that particular build made it to the top, maybe top four of whatever private tournaments that you were holding, or any of the
uh,
big tournaments?
I well, even within Ontario in Canada, that's where I am.
Hmm.
I'm one of the only few that did play a summon theme with Mastery, let alone locals. Like there was maybe one other person that built currently a summon theme deck with Mastery present in it,
Hmm.
and now it's me and her are now kind of going. Well, we have to change our decks a little bit. So
Hmm.
yeah.
So that being the case, by banning her, I mean, it didn't really shift the meta from what you're saying. It more so just killed off an archetype, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say killed off an archetype, just made it slightly weaker.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
because I ended up. I, I don't know how I feel about this in terms this part of it, but people are starting to net deck me and then use that net deck to alter it how they like. I'm like, oh, I'm happy but sad
Hmm.
that because it's and that's kind of what the other player I was mentioning is that she built it. She has two variants actually. There's one that's water lightning using it, and then there's water ice that's using it. But um,
Hmm.
she plays it, and then both me and her kind of look at each other, going, "Well, okay, I guess we gotta swap it out with for something." But we look at it going, "That's not too much of a big deal for us. Like, yeah, Mastery was great, but then we can. There's a couple cards coming out that just can easily replace her once the ban's in effect."
Hmm. So then, what would have been the purpose of the ban then? To like
Uh,
appease the current people? I again, I'm playing devil's advocate, so.
yeah. No, it's understandable. For us, it doesn't really matter too much. Then again, at my locals, I never played my summon deck, really.
Hmm.
Unless there was like a big crowd coming out for it, but otherwise, I just never played it.
I
Hmm.
never really saw the reason to ban Mashri, to be fair.
That's an interesting perspective. Why would you say that uh, you didn't think there was a reason to ban her?
Every time I've ever seen her, she just died immediately. Just
Hmm.
I've never had an issue with her at all. Every deck I've
Hmm.
ever seen ended up just losing in the tournament. I've never seen it win the tournament. So every time I seen a Martian Meat play it, it's like he ended just that player ended up losing the tournament. So it's like I don't actually see any reason behind it. And when she does die, they're just drawing a card. I've never seen any other effect except for Banish 3 draw a card before he dies.
Hmm. That's interesting. So, would you say maybe the reason she saw kind of like a ban was maybe due to like her I don't know, salt that she caused players to have, or maybe the
Well,
uh,
yeah, I would assume so.
Honestly, I think what they should have done for her is what they did with Sophie, restrict her to one.
hmm. Would you think that would have changed maybe the amount of frequency that people were, I don't know, seeing the card or maybe playing against the card?
I honestly think it would have changed a little bit more. At least restricting it to one, people would have to think a lot more better on how to put her in a certain deck over how to get her afterwards. Banning her outright, I can't see her being that strong to be banned outright. I personally think she should have gone to one first, had a feel, and be still put on the watch list as well as being at one. See how it
Hmm.
worked the format. If not, ban her
I
outright
found
afterwards.
I found there was a point in time, especially when I looked at decks online, it seemed like they were only playing one Mastery anyways. A lot of decks were, and even then, I found with the one Mastery, she was still doing a lot of work, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I agree with that sentiment. A lot of the Um, so FFTX, for you or for those of you who don't know, is a collection of information based on the card game. It's one of the strongest resources that we have for figuring out deck construction, seeing what other people are playing, and the most important, in my opinion, is also seeing tournament results. That allows people, particularly within the format, to see what other people are playing and likewise build similarly, or like Digger was saying previously, tech. I'm using air quotes, but you can't see it. Tech against those particular decks. So, in my looking, or I guess mild research of what people were playing, it did seem like Meepo was saying that Mashuri was, even at a one of, he would put in a considerable amount of work. I mean, the ability to bounce herself back in certain situations meant that trying to remove her effectively required multiple hoops. But that also meant that when she died, the likelihood of you seeing her again was pretty unlikely. Um, I do find that interesting that we're on both of the, or we have two different sides of the aisles where one half says I can completely understand why she was banned, and then the other half says you know um, she wasn't as big of a problem as some of the other things that exist in the meta currently. Um, so on that segue, do we want to talk about some of the other big boogeyman that exist in the format?
Um, Currently, which actually is on the watch list, and I knew he was kind of like a boogeyman card. I was just a little surprised that it took uh, Square Enix this long to put him on the watch, but whatever. Is Bismarck.
Hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was Bismarck a new addition to the watch list?
Yep.
Oh, now it makes yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, he's a new addition to the watch list. Sildra's still there, but Bismarck is added to that watch list now.
Do you perhaps want to explain, what Bismarck is about and what he does?
Yep. Let me just bring it up here. Bismarck. So Bismarck is a 5 CP wind forward legendary with 9k power from Final Fantasy XIV. Job is primal, which can be pretty relevant depending on how you build it. When a character is returned from the field to the owner's hand, which can correlate with Mashri, draw one card. This effect will only trigger once per turn. At the end of each of your turns, choose up to one wind character you control returned to the owner's hand. Doll one, and then the third ability is Doll one active wind forward, choose one forward, deal 2,000 damage. So that's pretty relevant in Wind because that's Wind's shtick is basically like resource control. So you're activating dulling, sometimes bouncing now, activating dulling, and then it's just like you can with Bismarck on the field, and you don't have to specifically wait a turn to do any of his abilities. This is either triggers off autos or you just do it right away. So it gives you a lot of advantage, and most of the time played against it is they play it on like turn at very most turn 4, and I'm like, well, I'm not doing anything.
Hmm. That's interesting. So, why would you particularly say that he is like a shoe-in for the ban list? What particularly about him, like, screams this card should be limited or banned? Because again, he's a legendary, so that means that sets are developed around these cards.
I want to say because of the Sky Dancers and all other Sky Pirates versions of and Wind decks that go, ooh, tap, burn, burn, I control, burn, because you can immediately tap them to burn.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay, so more the card particularly gives wind more interaction, is what you're saying.
yeah.
More control and be caveman. Me no light, me go burn.
Hmm. So I mean, on the to play devil's advocate again,
Mm.
particularly about the card's construction and the way that wind decks are operating. I mean, what else does particularly wind do that Bismarck is making innately strong? Because ultimately, the card by himself only he reads like a support manual. Like he only buffs or gives things that wind naturally is doing a little bit more of an edge. So why would you say that's ban worthy?
Uh, well, you are correct. It is basically a big toolkit that gives Wind um a lot more abilities and whatnot to deal with stuff. But with Mastery Band, I can understand why it's on the watch list because obviously when Mastery's banned, there's a lot more thought to try and figure out how to get more, get the same amount of advantage and value that Mastery gave Bismarck or otherwise.
Hmm.
So there could be a way that comes out that with a new card that just benefits off a lot of stuff, right?
And my
Hmm.
point of view on that one as well is you can just play him, have a bunch of wind characters, pass to your opponent, wait until he goes to the battle phase, and you go, hey, tap, burn, tap, burn, tap, burn. That's gone. Tap, burn, tap, burn, tap, burn. That's gone now.
And hasn't Bismarck been seen as well in some storm decks as well, like Ice Wind?
Yeah, I've
Hmm.
seen a couple storm decks splashing about water in there too.
Oh,
So traditionally, has in your opinion, have you seen Bismarck usually played alongside of Mashari? Have you, what particularly is Bismarck being played in that is giving people kind of boogeyman vibes?
For me personally, it's probably he's there and
Wind waters mainly.
he's usually played I think with like the one Mastery or so, but he's still it's either Bismarck with the Leviathan, and then once there's Mastery, it just gives a lot of value, and then there's summons that they use for stuff, but you keep it in the break zone, and you don't get it back. So I'm just going to like get a lot of value out of this because I have things that just when something bounces, draw a card, something loses 9k off Leviathan, and then you just kill things in the process. So it's like it's kind of that value where I've seen play a lot of times.
Sure. I mean, particularly, is that something that's showing up in your meta? The only reason I
Sometimes.
ask is because, based on the information that FFDex is promoting, I mean, there are very few decks that actually have Bismarck and Mashari coupled together that are winning tournaments. So I'm curious to see why people are saying, particularly these two cards together have a synergy when they're not being played together. So I'm curious.
The only reason why I say that I've seen her played with Bismarck is that she's a one of, and they just go, I mean, sure, type deal. If they have
Hmm,
if they draw her and they get the chance to play her, they'll do so.
hmm,
I want to say not in our locals, but a few towns down from different style locals that's pretty much given up there. I barely see Bismarck in ours,
Yeah.
but I do see one or two maybe Marshallese at ours because, like Digger said, or Feather has said that he's pretty much one and one other person plays Marshallese, but I've not seen a
hmm.
single Bismarck in ours. But few decks had Bismarck, and like I said, they wait until you basically your combat goes tap burn dead, tap burn
Hmm.
Yeah.
dead.
But it's but again, it's not like the Mashri is being played in the same deck as those cards to the frequency that, would require it being banned, correct? Because if you think about it, like Mashri's construction requires, I'd say, sub 16 summons in order to particularly
Yeah.
get true value for her. And Wind particularly doesn't have many good uh, Wind summons for her to particularly abuse. So,
Yeah.
um,
But like I said, she's usually a one of, and I've seen her played once, in not locals, but in other few towns.
hmm,
One being in Gatineau, whereas I believe it was just the one instance where she was played. I was like, oh, okay.
hmm,
Yeah, the difference between the only reason why they probably play one Mushri in them is because they're not just a wind deck, they're wind water or wind ice.
hmm. But is Wind Ice really running that many summons?
Actually, yes, scary enough.
What summons would you say that Wind Ice is running?
They're doing a lot of the summons for the ice is to outright they blow every time they play something to destroy all your dull forwards that are there. There's the ones where they'll cast and dull and freeze your units, giving Bismarck able to go. Heck, can't attack at the moment, so tap burn you.
Yeah, they haven't killed something with a nice ability. And something untaps on your turn, they'll kill with Bismarck for advantage. He just kind of sits there going, "I'm doing a thing until you want to do something."
Hmm.
They're not
So
using
that's
Bismarck to
that's
attack with. They're using Bismarck to go tap burn.
that's interesting because here in the States, the meta is like pretty, what I would say, like very, 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 um, like aggressive. And frankly, Bismarck decks don't exist here.
Really?
A majority of the time, Wind Ice loses in specific matchups. Specifically here, um, to kind of give like an idea of how construction for Mashari decks work, is that a majority of the time the Mashari herself requires quite a bit of devotion in order to get her abilities to be oppressive. So, like I was saying, like maybe 16 cards out of the deck require or are required to be summons, excluding Mashari, in order for her to particularly abuse those cards. So in that means that the forwards that Bismarck particularly uses in order to, use his burn effects are less. And because there are less forwards, that means Bismarck's abilities are less potent. Um, so normally you would never see those two cards, in my opinion, particularly together because of how drastically they play side by side. Like you said, you might run a single Mashri in a deck, but you would almost have to guarantee a particular amount of summons in order for her to get her ability. Because if Mashri has to choose between drawing a card and or bouncing a card, and they only have 3 summons in their whole entire deck, then that means 90% of the time Mashri is doing nothing. Um, so majority of the time in Ice Wind, if you were to look at any of the deck lists that exist on FF decks, a majority are very, very forward heavy. They might run a playset of the 2CP Chocobo that on cast allows you to bounce a forward and draw a card. But outside of that, I don't really particularly see many summon decks run with Bismarck, just because of how counterintuitive it is to his game plan. Um, so yeah, I can understand how like Mashri and him together could be very good, but because of how the decks are constructed, particularly here, we don't see many of it. What we do see, particularly when it comes to Bismarck, is Ice Wind, Water Wind, Mono Wind specifically, and then those decks he puts in a lot of work because of how drastic. His abilities can be with those forwards because his card text actually reads only he's only able to bounce technically wind characters. So outside of that, you would have to find other ways to bounce forwards to get value from him. So in those decks that run heavy wind forwards or heavy wind backups or even heavy wind monsters. Those decks particularly get the most out of Bismarck. So I find it curious that people, put those two cards together, yet construction-wise, they actually don't work very well together.
Yeah, which I can see that. I just kind of go, oh, okay, I guess it's the only copy. And like you said, there's
Yeah,
not a lot of summons in there. They just kind of have it just in case you need to do a little battle trick to go, okay, I got only 3 summons. I'm just gonna. If they have Bismarck and Leviathan there, they just put monsters. They can.
mm,
I'm just gonna do a bunch of shenanigans and then, yeah.
yeah. That's interesting though, because the construction of Mono Wind, the way that it plays particularly, is very, very slow. It's very consistent. In that, early it wants to set up value through backups and through engines like Fat Chocobo that want to draw itself passive cards, so that it can get to maybe the mid game or the late game. So usually those decks usually take a beating from very aggressive decks that you know punish them for not having forwards early or punish them for not having presence early against those kind of decks. So Bismarck, like you were saying, he usually will come down like turn 4, but against a deck like Meepos that maybe runs Dragoons, Mono Wind has a really hard time keeping up. So I find that curious that Bismarck is on the ban list
Yeah. Um.
or the watch list, excuse me.
Yeah. Um.
Yeah.
Have you been seeing anything different in your local Ceramipo with it, or?
No, only because of the fact that honestly, there's nobody here has any Bismarcks. Nobody's pulled any or bought any or went out of the way to get any. Now, I do have one player who would like to make a deck with Bismarck, but he just haven't got his way for it yet.
Mm.
Other than Masquerade though, I have one or two players that might use it, but you don't see her pop up much. And I feel like out of my group, I might be the one using Masquerade the most. Um, and normally for me, I'm like, well, if I really want to try to free of this card, I'll go out and get a plate set of that card. But like I said before with Masquerade, I only had the one, and I found that just the one was doing a lot of work for just being one card in the deck. The most recent thing I used her in was Ice Water Terror Spellbook deck, and like I didn't get her early to mid game, but late game when she came out, I had 12 summons in my break zone, and she just got the job done. She was unstoppable at that point. And for
Mm,
me, that's the scary part about Masquerade, especially when it comes to mid to late game, and you still have that quantity in your break zone to start pulling off effects. She seems like a big formidable person to take care of.
mm, that's
Now,
understandable.
yeah, with the online tournaments we've been seeing lately, I've only played against Bismarck once or twice, and from those decks alone, I mean, I had a great time playing against it. But from those 2 times I played against Bismarck, I can see why he would be on the watch list. I can see how formidable he can be, especially once he's got the setup going on with like all the cards he can activate and ping and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm. So my curiosity here, hopefully this doesn't come across like being like callous or anything like that, but um, so would you say that Bismarck is more of a problem in that his text is too powerful, or is it more of a problem of maybe the mindset of the player going against the deck? Because sometimes when you play against, I don't know, let's say an aggro deck and you're a control deck, you have to pivot your game plan in order to change how you play against those decks. So if I see my opponent is playing mono wind, I might drop 2 forwards early to get in maybe a couple of points of damage before they're particularly set up, and then they're on the back burner where they're particularly trying to struggle to make sure that they don't get that 6th or 7th point of damage. So, would you say that's maybe like because people aren't playing against Bismarck enough, they're maybe not particularly seeing these lines, like these ways of playing differently against the deck?
Hmm. I'm not really too sure. And similar to Meepo, we did pull Bismarcks, but there wasn't a lot of people that got them. And when they did get them, a lot of the meta players immediately came to us or other people and went, we'll trade this and buy those cards. I'm like, okay. So we didn't really, at least for my locals, we didn't really have much of a chance to really play test with Bismarck because people put like a want list on them immediately,
Mm.
and we got them. I was like, well, okay. So,
Hmm.
and then
So this is
afterwards, it's like we would try to do trades if they had extras. Like, no, I'm keeping them. Okay.
Yeah,
mm.
yeah.
So would you say particularly in the meta that exists within your locals that decks with Bismarck are topping fairly often, or would you say that they're just something that people recognize as a strong card and thus that's why they're holding on to them?
I think a little bit of both, to be honest.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
I say locals in terms of like Ontario or Canada wide, to be honest.
I don't see a single Bismarck deck at all in the Kingston locals at all.
Hmm.
Not a single one.
Yeah, that's due to the reason that not a lot of people have them available to them, and if they do, they're being held on to.
I
Hmm.
think I think around the time that Opus 14 came out and even 15, I think if our community at the time, a lot of some of the existing players did come back. I wouldn't be surprised if one or two of them, especially because I can think of two people who love playing mono win decks. If we had the player base at the time, I could definitely see one or two people playing Bismarck and decks, which is totally fine.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, as someone who particularly likes playing wind or water decks, my worst matchup, as someone who does run Bismarck in their decks, is decks that put early board. Really makes me have to change my game plan and the way that
Yeah.
I set up my field, and almost to the point that it becomes detrimental because um, mono wind really doesn't turn on until it has at least it can run with very few backups, but it wants its backup line to be set fairly early
Mm.
because a lot of Win's abilities come at the cost of activation. So getting free backups or getting free untaps of cards, which makes certain cards at a redux of their cost due to that free activation. So if I don't have backups and I'm playing, I don't know, let's say, for example, for those of you who don't know, there's a monster named Ochu. He's a 1 CP 7k that can become a forward at damage 3. And when he enters, you, the player, get to choose 2 backups that you control and activate them. So that falls into the what Yuki was saying about having cheap bodies that Bismarck can tap and thus deal damage. But unless I'm at 3 damage, they're not forwards, and then I can bounce them at the end of turn with Bismarck's ability to draw cards. But I'm then losing out on those forwards. So if I am not set up with my backups, those 1 drops get me no value. And they do me nothing until I'm maybe past 3 damage, and then even then, I have to continue to keep board pressure while also being starved in my backup line, which means that my games are going actually poorly in that in that setting. So decks like Mashari that particularly didn't really need many backups to function. Um, really punished my mono wind decks, specifically, mono wind. I mean, mono ice or excuse me, ice wind has more flexibility, but even then, a lot of the ice wind decks are running multi-element cards, and if you do not have a backup of wind or a backup of ice, in order to pay 2 to play a backup that activates 2 backups, I mean you're sorely falling behind, and it kind of makes how you play the deck. It can make it painstaking. So I find it curious that people, um, you know, say that Bismarck is problematic, but a majority of games in which he's problematic in are maybe mid to late game. And one of the biggest boogeymen that's in the format currently, Soiree Members, is an aggro deck that plays like a control deck that can go into the late game and still be very powerful. So um, Soray members basically destroys. Half of the reason I haven't played as much Wind is because of Soray members, and how powerful and consistent they are. Um, so yeah, that's my only argument against like why Bismarck is not a problem card. He's very situationally good, and when he does get his value, I can understand how it feels like a lock. But I mean, a lot of decks can say that they have that kind of power when they're in, mid to late game.
I think part of it for me too is that Win, I guess, just has the Win element in the game just has so many good cards that just benefit off each other. Like Ochu activates, the new Atomos activates. I know at one point people were losing their mind about Althea, the Opus 12 heroic backup, how she was able to activate and return stuff to the hand. So I think it's just, I mean, it's not a strong argument, but I think all the crazy support Win gets, and then they come out with Bismarck, who just amplifies all that advantage, right? I think that's a lot of it for me.
Yeah, but without Bismarck, what does Wind have? Like, I mean, they have great forwards, and they have a lot of activation, but without that payoff card, what does Wind have?
Yeah,
Sky
by
Pirates
far.
is water, but that's also a tribal deck. And like, yes, Bismarck can put in work in Sky Pirates, but ultimately the synergy of Sky Pirates is what makes Sky Pirates powerful. Bismarck is just he's like another value piece for the already powerful engine. Um, I mean, you can go games with in Sky Pirates where Bismarck, you don't even have to draw Bismarck, but if you play Pinello, who is a key piece within Sky Pirates, um, you can be even more degenerate with Pinella than you can Bismarck, because her abilities cost 0, while Bismarck requires things such as forwards and backups to be set up. So, I mean, I just find that curious as well.
I could also totally see Bismarck being on the watch list for the new Canal to compare.
Sure. Do you want to read her ability for those of us who may or may not know?
With the new Canelo, she's a 2 CP win forward. Her job is now Dancer, and at the end of each of your turns, for each card you cast this turn, deal 1,000 damage to all forwards via foot control. You can go one card named Dancer or Job Dancer other than Canelo you control. Choose one forward via foot control, and it cannot reduce your cast.
So, basically, she can be somewhat like a board wipe, but she has to see those casts, correct?
Only for the 1,000 at the end of the turn. She could just tap
Okay.
herself right off the bat and turn something into 4K, and then Bismarck just needs to tap himself and one other win forward, and just gone.
So you're spending multiple resources in order to remove one forward, is what you're saying, right?
Just requires 3, but yes.
Okay. So in consideration to like Soray members that can play Morald, which is a 4 CP body that has haste based on, the likelihood that you're running a Soray list that has a bunch of Soray members, since their backup lines are mostly Soray, and she can break something as well. So like that's my argument against Bismarck is like, again, yes, that's very very powerful, but you have to be set up for that. While Soray is doing what it's doing just naturally, like you're going to play backups naturally, you're going to have forwards naturally, and those forwards all get devotion from each other. So like when I look at like a 1-for-1 on like the power scale, like I can't quite. I mean, I don't mean to come across being argumentative, but I can't quite agree with the power level at which people are consistently saying Bismarck is at. I mean, yes, eventually he will, if they print some more bounce cards, maybe his power level will continue to climb. But I mean, any card can really be said at that level. I mean, we have a lot more synergies, or a lot more powerful synergies in Final Fantasy than just Bismarck. So that was also my argument against Mashari's banning. Is specifically that Mashari required so much of an investment into the deck archetype that yes, while she is powerful and yes, she can be consistent, the tournaments in which Mashari was being played, fortunately enough, she tops maybe I would say like top 4, but she narrowly clinches wins. While decks like Soray members that received no bans this set continue to run rampant.
Well, Soiree did get a ban, but not in standard.
So not in a meaningful way.
Not really. No, she is banned in. Blah, 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 let me see. Right. So. Blah,
I
blah,
believe
blah.
it was title.
Title in the limited series.
So formats that particularly don't actually see competitive play.
Not really. No, only at events or so, right?
So that's why I find this kind of like how do I want to say it's somewhat funny in that the card we've been talking for maybe the last couple of almost an hour now, and out of all the cards that we haven't seen much of, there are a lot of the ones that are on the ban list. Yet the ones that we're seeing the majority of in tournament play received very little to no attention.
Yeah.
So, for example, Tilka Loop, which is one of the ways that Final Fantasy. So, for those of you who don't know, Tilka Loop is an infinite combo that runs solely with the backup that reduces the cost of all your characters till the end of turn by just simply tapping it. And that deck is miserable to play against if you've ever played against a loop deck. It can win in just one turn. And like we were saying earlier, Mashari can feel powerful in that she makes it so that certain interactions are difficult to resolve when it comes to like standard ways of dealing damage. But Mashari actually has a miserable time playing against Loop because Loop decks actually want all their forwards back in their hand at some point in time. To explain how it works, it revolves around the ep.1 Valifor that on cast allows you to bounce back all of your forwards and all of your opponent's forwards to their hands. And likewise, it abuses a card that recently was printed, the 2CP Zidane, that reads, when he enters the field, to TLDR, when he enters the field, you get to remove one of your opponent's cards from the top of their deck. So the deck runs this combo where it can continually cast Valifor for free, technically for free, and bounce Zidane back to hand over and over and over and over and over, and exile your opponent's deck, and then pass turn, which is very, very oppressive to play against. Yet that card received no bans.
Yeah.
I'm sure the developers are very aware of this infinite combo. It was originally spoiled or developed by, I believe, one of our world champions.
He was also, I think he's like a level 2 judge in Australia.
Yes.
Chris Matisky?
Chris Matisky, yes.
Yep.
So that being the case, a lot of actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if it's Worlds or if it's Nationals. I think it's Worlds. But nevertheless, the developers knew that this infinite combo existed, yet they chose not to act on it. So I find that curious. So I wonder what you guys, or what your opinion on this infinite combo and why it wasn't touched. How you feel about that?
I remember seeing his first iteration of the Infinite Loop, which was like you had the RNG's dream board, like your side to go. I can do infinite loop, and then now with the new cards added, it's like, so before it wasn't viable. You can do it. This wasn't viable in a natural match. It was, like I said, dream board it, and then you can do a thing. So it wasn't anything great, and he knew it, but he still built it. So I'm pretty sure the team did see that, didn't think anything of it, but he knew about it, and then it's now come into a bit of a problem. So yeah.
So would you say that Mashuri was more of a problem than like an infinite combo deck?
The thing is that with an infinite combo deck, if it gives your opponent no way of interacting like between each ability, there is a ruling against it where you have to state how the wording go. I don't know if it's been updated, but last I read, there's a way to stop the infinite loop so it doesn't continuously go off everything if your opponent can't interact with it.
But what ways in which? So what are the ways in which you can interact with it? Just for those who aren't familiar with how loop plays.
So if you can't, so when each ability goes off, it's like I'll just say you tap Telika for whatever and tap something else in response. Each time they do an ability, it goes back to priority for the opponent to try to figure out if they want to interact or respond to each ability, and that's the only way that I can see that infinite loop not being hit per se for the ruling to kick in, is because it still gives your opponent an opportunity to interact with
But
you doing the loop.
how often are they interacting during those types of turns? Like the loop deck runs counter magic and it runs control cards such as Lael, and it can run Mist Dragons to counter the interaction. So how often, for example, let's say is Ice interacting with the loop deck? Like, how does Ice stop it?
Ice can stop it in a few ways. I think they have a couple things where if they target something, it punishes the opponent to do so, or something like that. But
sure, but let's say that. So in order for loop to work, you need 5 backups, and you need 3 forwards and 1 monster and 1 summon, right? And the deck runs 3 ofs of all of these things.
Yeah.
So how often is it that loop? And mind you, Ice's control mechanism is usually dull and freeze. And while Wind does complete activation, like free activation, mind you.
Yeah.
Ice really doesn't have many, in my opinion, Ice doesn't have many ways of actually stopping these Wind Earth decks.
No, I mean, like I said, they can. Well, I can probably slow it down a little bit. It just means that within the loop, there's a couple extra steps that have to be taken, but it doesn't change the fact that it'll still loop.
Exactly. So the same with Lightning. How does Lightning stop the loop decks?
Well, currently Lightning is kind of a little underwhelming. Currently, sadly, but it's
the same with Wind. How does Wind? Because we were talking about Bismarck earlier. So how does Wind stop the loop decks?
It just has to. Oh my god. I honestly, I don't really know too much. It's like on that particular topic, right?
Yeah, my argument against like why Tilica is problematic is because, you know, the majority of the control colors right now are in Earth and Wind, and a majority of those decks really abuse cards that are particularly within this deck, like Tilka. Being able to turn monsters into 1 CP monsters is very, very powerful. Being able to turn forwards that are normally 3 CP into 1 CP forwards, or even 2 CP forwards, very, very powerful. So that I would have almost put Tilka above Mashuri in these in you know the order of bans, specifically because while Mashuri is a forward and her abilities revolve around summons, you're not going to win on one giant turn with Mashiri, but you will with a loop deck. Like you will win. Like it's
Yeah.
inevitable. Like once they
Uh,
draw, into the forward that they need, uh, it's over. And the deck has ways of tutoring itself
yeah.
through this lovely backup called Fiona. So I mean, it's not entirely when we say it's they have to set up. It's not entirely difficult for them to do so. Um, so if you're playing a mid-range deck, like and you're against a loop deck, if your opponent is able to execute the loop effectively, you lose. You just lose. And I don't know if that's like worse than having to watch your forwards get bounced. But I don't know. As someone who personally my least favorite card is Mind Flayer, and nothing's a little more painful than watching your opponent borrow your cards, but to have your whole entire deck exiled in one turn is almost like psychological warfare, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So,
That's
so yeah, I don't know if that's inherently degenerate, but I mean, if I were looking at a game from a standpoint of interaction, the amount of interaction there is very niche. Like maybe earth and fire are the only elements that maybe could interject, but the way that they interject is only meaningful if the earth or if the loop deck doesn't respond, and if they do respond, it can be a miserable time.
yeah. Other than that, yeah, it's then that's probably where the ruling comes in to kind of stop the infinite part, because there's a spot in the rule book last I saw. I haven't read fully the updated rules, but last I saw previously, if there's an infinite loop, there is a ruling to kind of halt that in particular. I think if
Okay,
I
what
understood,
what does the ruling read?
if I understood, I haven't read the update like I said, but last time I read it was they said each player picks a number within reason, and that will be a combined number for the loop to do, and then after that number is exhausted, the loop stops.
Really?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Where? How come it hasn't showed up in competitive play?
You know what? That's a good question, because yeah, they do that, but I'm thinking, doesn't don't people actually know that was a ruling? Like people were trying, in my locals in the beginning, were trying to figure out how to do an infinite, and we read that there was a ruling to stop that basically, and they're like, everyone's going, well, crap.
I mean, if it was a ruling, then Chris Matiski wouldn't be playing it in tournaments. So
That's weird to me, because
yeah, and not that I'm trying to question your the validity or excuse me, the fidelity of this ruling. I'm not entirely sure. Like, I've never seen it enforced.
well,
So I
that's why
mean,
I was saying, if he has it built to where the opponent can technically interact, like between the loops and the steps to do it, so then it doesn't fall under that infinite loop spot. It's considered as some call it, a soft loop, which is still continuing though. So
yeah, but they'll just. So I mean, even if you try to interact, I mean, the way that it wins is literally milling your opponent out. And from the competitive play that it's seen, it is always resolved milling its opponent out or exiling their deck. So I mean, I'd love to hear or see where this ruling is at, because if it is, then that means that some large tournaments have been ruling them improperly. But a lot of
I'll
these
see if I can
tournaments are run
find
by
it.
some of the community leaders, so I highly doubt that they would allow a ruling like this to go
I'm
unnoticed.
trying to find see the updated rule book on it, so that way I can. Is that it? Yeah. Okay. So let's see if I can download the file here, the OpenSet file, because I remember clearly seeing wording on infinite loops. Like it was very part of where it was his own little section, to be honest.
Hmm.
So when you brought up the point of why was that, it seems weird. Why would it?
Yeah. So I mean, like I would love for there to be like some sort of ruling that says otherwise, but even then, that negates some of the effects of Tilka. Well, it actually doesn't affect any of the Tilka abilities. It still makes Tilka problematic because, I mean, for example, back in the day there was a Shikary's list that
yeah.
ran Eldnarch and somewhat of a loop where it was able to tutor out another Eldnarch and then take an extra turn and then kill your opponent before they lost the game. Um, and I mean, Tilka pretty much made that deck work super smooth. So I don't know. I want to believe that there is like some you know information on that, but since the deck is being played, like it shows up to competitions, I'm surprised.
Yeah,
Like
that's I'm trying to look up and see if they updated that part. Going trying to go through all the stuff here. Okay, resolving action. Oh, this might be it actually. Resolving and summons action abilities are by special abilities. Okay, so we're both okay.
So while Digger is looking
Sorry,
for the
I'll
ruling,
yeah.
is there particularly? I mean, um, since we're on the topic of like powerful cards, particularly what we're noticing is like certain elements don't have those noticeably powerful cards. What would you say is particularly the element that would require the most love, maybe in the upcoming sets, in order for it to be viable again? Because there are a couple. So
I think Lightning deserves a bit more. I feel like they need a little boost again.
sure, what would you particularly say Lightning per se needs? Like in your opinion,
Oh,
as someone who's played Lightning.
that is a good question. I think Lightning needs this. I think they're slowly starting to do it, but I think they need to stop having effects like, oh, you can do a certain amount of damage, but can only be active, like active forwards. Needs to be less cards of that. Other than that, I can't really pinpoint what it is. It just seems like with the last few sets, I just never seen much to give Lightning a big boost. That being
Mhm.
said, though, they've done some cool stuff. Like, for example, like I absolutely love the new Seymour that came out of Opus 16. I think they did some pretty cool effects on him, and he's just a rare.
Sure. Do you want to read what Seymour does?
Certainly, that won't take me long. Yeah, the new Seymour is a 4 CP Lightning Forward, 7,000 power. Um, Category 10. His effect is when he enters the field, choose a forward your opponent controls. If you have 3 or more summons in your break zone, break it. And then secondly, he's got a second ability, Dull. Remove 6 summons from the break zone. Seymour deals your opponent 1 point of damage.
So again, it's like a very summon heavy deck. So
It is,
you would have.
yeah.
So the construction wise, like Seymour really gets value out of like heavy summoner decks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So then, particularly, would you think that Lightning's like archetype needs to be more around like summons? Do you think they need better like? I know Lightning's backup line is kind of like dismal in that it doesn't really have backups that tutor each other. Um, it doesn't have like backups that really like tutor like key pieces of your deck the same way that like earth or water or even wind uh, can just tutor whatever they want.
Um, oh,
So
so me and Yuki were trying to simultaneously look it up. Yuki did find the ruling for the infinite loop, so
Let's
sure,
hear it.
can you read it?
Yeah, section.
So, in that case, we're talking about whether or not a loop is happening regardless whether or not someone is interacting with it, correct? So, for example, like cards that are interacting that have auto abilities, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so then the loop deck actually gets around that because we're not interacting with the loops of the abilities, we're looping situations. So Zidane isn't infinitely milling your opponent. Zidane is instances of 1 mill every time you cast Valifor. So that gets around that.
Yeah, like I was saying, it's if your opponent has any way, auto ability or otherwise, that interacts with it, then like you said, it gets around that whole infinite loop part.
So, for example, if I cast Valifor, pop Zidane, plays Zidane, and then cast Valifor, pop Zidane, play Zidane, cast Valifor, pop Zidane, play Zidane, that's not technically acting as an infinite loop based on the ruling that you just read.
And if you're going to then you have to if that is right.
Yeah, but if I'm
Really forces you to continue, it's an infinite.
yeah, but I'm not activating an infinite auto ability. I'm activating one instance every cast, which can be interacted with. Because interaction in that instance is asking whether or not Valifor resolves. So I'm casting Valifor, asking if it resolves. No, I can as the active player, I can ask you every time and continue every time, and you will mill every time. That doesn't stop it.
No, but that falls under the that's why there's separate rules on page -2 and -3.
So an
Because
infinite
you
loop
know
in this ruling, an infinite loop would be, for example, Renoa and a card like what's that? He's from Kingsglaive, Regis. In that Regis will, bring back forwards that have died, and Renoa will bounce Regis, and then Regis will bring back forwards that have died. So if you have a way of sacking uh, Renoa, you can continually loop those forwards coming, entering, leaving, entering,
Um,
leaving, entering, leaving,
so
and that's an actual loop.
that's an auto ability forcing you to.
yeah, so I did,
Sure.
so I did see the. I don't know if you had the updated 2022 ruling, Yuki, in front of you. I'll read the one I have, which is one I. If it still is the same thing, then I'll think you to say so. It's section 13, 13.1, 13.2, and 13.3 in the updated rulebook, English edition. I had to kind of state that just in case there was any mistranslations if it was Japanese. um, so, infinite loops occur, blah blah blah, and the same procedure happens repeatedly. If an infinite loop is triggered and no players are able to take action to stop it, the game ends in a draw. It's basically a double loss. If a player
So
can
then,
stop the
why
loop,
wouldn't?
then the following rules below apply. So, if
Yeah. So if I choose to stop the loop once you have no cards in deck, I don't lose, do I?
If
Because
you're going to
I'm
continue loop and you know it's a continue loop, you actually have to choose something times.
yeah,
so then I just ask how many cards are in your deck, and then I mill you them.
Pretty much,
yeah,
So then, so then, what is the point of the ruling then? Because it doesn't actually stop the current loop deck.
so I'll get to 13.2 and 3 here. So, this is 13.2. If only one player can stop the loop,
it's the exact same thing.
yeah, that's pretty much that player chooses how many times, blah blah blah, forces blah, blah. If the and then 3 is if both players can stop the loop, the turn player chooses how many, blah blah blah. So yeah, it's just slightly different wording.
No, same thing.
So what we've come to the conclusion was is I can ask my opponent cards in deck. You can say 34, and then I will say I will activate this 34 times, and then we resolve it. Sure, and then we resolve it, and then you lose as the opponent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And I, the loop player, I, the loop player, win the match through Deca.
Yeah, if you were able to somehow stop a little bit of it, you can turn around and just go, whoops, he still lived.
So then,
But
how is that less problematic? Like, how is that less problematic than some of the other cards we have on the watch or ban list?
Yeah, no, that's I I no, so yeah, that makes sense. But for me, it's just like I'm pretty sure I read something about infinite loops here in the rule book.
Yeah, but obviously it's being played, so like how is that less problematic than cards like Bismarck? Like we're talking about like your opponent literally will not be able to play. They watch you continue this loop over and over and over, and then what?
my thoughts on
Like,
infinite first part is the fact that you guys do a first literally one turn, while Bismarck is pretty much here to sit here and for wasting resources when you're about to be back from and taking extra long to get the second game. Instead of like
th-
waiting for the game.
is that very FFTCG though? Is that like what we would call a fair game in Final Fantasy?
Hmm.
If I can kill you straight out with an infinite loop through a combo that took a while to set up, yes. Instead of
But it didn't take a while to set up. See, that's a very
as a new player, when
hmm.
I find that decks that literally control the field that you are, I can't do anything throughout the whole game, and your focus is just bouncing things, making more resources, drawing away, making more resources so I can't even play the game anymore during the game while we're playing, and I take it 7 points. I'm going to get 7 points damage, but yet that's going to take almost a 45 minutes, while in Infinite Loop, you go within, say, 10 minutes, you're dead. That way, as a new player, I have no fun in the game when I can't play the game while you just infinite loop me and just kill me. I'd have a little bit more fun in that end, while I can just move on and do another thing, instead of being stuck in the same game and being tortured until I lose.
But isn't hmm.
I think
You
it's
see,
more of a
I
social
can't
thing.
agree with that. Yeah, I can't agree with that because frankly, so the game's inherent design is for damage based combat. It's very much like you have to hit your opponent, and when you change that and you make it so that your opponent simply watches you combo off for what could be 25 minutes, because if you have to iterate every instance of the loop, um, you're going to have to show that you can do it. The time that would be invested in that loop would actually be much more degenerate than I think actually winning through combat. Specifically because Final Fantasy isn't an infinite game. Like this is literally one of the few infinite combos that we have, the few viable infinite combos that we have.
I think.
So
Sorry.
as a design company that particularly favors combat-based win cons, I'm surprised that they would not see this card Tilka as problematic.
That's a good point. Though I think the reason why they put two reasons, sorry, that they put the Bismarck and whatnot on the ban list rather than the Talika is probably because a the amount. I'm going to be honest, the amount of salt that's going around because of it. And that's a whole other topic, but that's just part of it. Um, And the other reason is probably because it's more of a social aspect in terms of interactions rather than if there is an infinite loop, they get to state, yeah, I'm doing this X amount of times and you lose. It just gets straight to the point and deals with the match, where the other stuff is
It's
step
like
by step by step, and your opponents just get more aggravated as each step goes. Is like, okay. So I think it's more of a social aspect, so it's a degenerate social aspect, than it is just straight up, how many things you have in deck? Okay, cool, I'm doing this amount of times, you lose. Then it gets straight to the point, like, okay, you got it. Good game.
like if
But,
you
that,
can
but
demonstrate
that's
your deck
not
3 times and you're gonna go, this loop's gonna continue to do more, you can outright state how many 3 times you're gonna hit as a quick Bismarck and the Mastery can go to the point where you can just torture your opponent until you finally win.
But see, that's the so in your statement, you're saying that Mastery is not allowing you to play, and thus you are not having fun because it is taking time for your opponent to deal you damage. Yet the mill deck is taking time in which you don't get to play, in which you don't get to respond, and thus that's more fun than not being able to play via a card that actually has to hit you.
It's like
That's what
getting
you're
a
saying.
Band-Aid off. It's just over and done with really quickly instead of someone just taking something and then stabbing you like multiple times.
But the chance of you coming back against Manchery is higher than you coming back against Mill.
Yes, unless they literally pull the entire game where you are having one card for
But how is Manchery affecting your deck and or your hand?
It could also be where Marguerite bouncing Typhoon you back to their hand, and you're replaying Typhoon and bouncing it to this card. It could be multiple different Marguerite getting different cards together. You can target your
Sure, but you can still Amaterasu the ETB of the forward that comes in, and then Manchery would have to respond. And if you respond to Manchery's triggers, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, Manchery is much more in that state. Final Fantasy isn't an infinite game. It's not meant to be one person takes one massive turn.
Yeah.
And thus, because of that, when you argue against that, you are inherently arguing almost from like, no offense, from like a Yu-Gi-Oh! Or a Magic the Gathering perspective, where those things inherently are designed in the game. This was never truly designed to be this way. So when you argue against,
designed in Yu-Gi-Oh! That
sh-
anything that's infinite loop, it's gone immediately back.
okay, but that's hindsight. My point is, this game was never developed to be that way. So when you're arguing against it, the weight that you're putting on like one half and consider to the other, you're saying that it's fun to be infinite or to have someone infinite you, but it's less fun to actually do it through combat. Because if I, let's say, in many matches against Digger, where I was playing Mashri, he would hit an EX that would destroy me. It would ruin my game plan, and I would have to come back from that. But that opportunity would never be given to Digger if I was running a mill deck or a loop deck, in that he wouldn't have those opportunities, he wouldn't have those chances. There's no comeback mechanic in that.
Yeah.
And that, in my opinion, is much more degenerate than having the opportunity to watch your forwards and or your EXs and or your hand deal with your opponent. That, I feel, is more inherently Final Fantasy than watching your opponent simply activate an infinite number of effects. Like literally infinite. Like if I wanted to, even after you had no cards in deck, I could continue. So when you have effects like that can just go on and on and on and on and on, like that's more, in my opinion, that's more degenerate and that's less fun than actually if I gave you a chance through combat to deal damage to me.
Yeah.
I mean,
But-
that's more inherently Final Fantasy.
Yeah, well, like I said, I wasn't arguing either or. I was just going, here could be one side, here could be the other. This is what I think could be part of it. Like,
Oh no, I agree with that sentiment. I just my argument is more along the lines of, if that is the game plan, particularly with Tilka decks, why is Tilka around then?
My
Like,
my only 2 cents on it all is like I kind of get both sides. I think both Mashiri and Tilika can be cards that can be disliked. I could be wrong about this, but maybe a lot of it comes down to you see when you see tournaments in the top 8s and the top 16. I could be wrong about this, but maybe you see more Bismarcks and Mashiris than you do of the Tilika deck. And my experience with Yu-Gi-Oh was it takes a world tournament, an international tournament, or a big global tournament for the creators of the game to finally recognize if a card is broken or OP or is degenerate and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, I just find it interesting that the perspective here is like, so in the States here, we we play what's meta. We don't really do the whole like, I want to build I don't know, a cute deck or a pet deck. We have those, but they never really make it to the top levels of play. But if you are a player and you understand that your opponents, don't like to see certain things, we do an adequate job of self-policing. But that being said, because the loop exists, means that the chance of someone running up against it is always going to be there. And as cards get developed, the loop will just become more consistent. So I'm surprised that the consistency of saying cards like Sildra or Bismarck were much more degenerate than the chance of running up against more loop-esque decks. Because, I mean, if you saw in Florida, there was a tournament that ran a similar style deck to Matiski's. It was an Earth-Wind combo list that could consistently use Fiona turn after turn after turn to find all of its pieces, and once it found all of its pieces, it would kill your opponent through 7 points of damage. Well, it would deal 6 points of damage and then play Titan and break all of its forwards and then deal you a point of damage. And that made tournament play here in the States out of 50 people. So, I mean, that's why I can't quite agree with the sentiment that, loop is not a problem, yet forwards that are viable for their engines. Like, don't get me wrong, Bismarck is powerful, but it is what allows Wind to be playable right now. Don't get me wrong, Mashari was powerful, but she was what allowed, in my opinion, a lot of water decks to be viable. She allowed a lot of summon decks to be viable. Without them, those archetypes don't see play anymore. And without them, they were, the next thing in line is going to, take place or take its spot. So like, if it's not summon decks, it's going to be Sorai members. If it's not Sorai members, it's going to be Sky Pirates. If it's not Sky Pirates, it'll be Ice Wind. If it's not Ice Wind, it'll be I don't know. They're Final Fantasy VII Avalanche. Like, there are powerful decks in the format that exist. I just don't think to that degree they're as degenerate as something that says literally, oh, okay, I'm going to do this an infinite amount of time. Thus, everything that you came to play with today will not be seen. So, I don't know that, like, gauges maybe with you guys, but, like, I'd be interested to see how you gauge against that.
I guess it's difference of community players and what they tend to play, right? So that's the only thing I can see in like community mindsets and whatnot. So,
but is Final Fantasy being played more in a casual sense, or is it being played like, do people play with the mindset of being casual, or do they play with the mindset of being or winning? Like, how do they?
In Kingston per se, it's more of a casual mindset than it is a competitive. Yeah, until Kingston's monthly tournament and or the Ontario Seasonal Series, and only then does it get a little bit more competitive. At least for
so
Kingston
if someone particularly brings Loop to a competitive scene, is that less or more degenerate than someone
people will just probably just outright get up and walk out.
So then, is that inherently Final Fantasy, or is that less, or is that something else?
I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to this.
Oh no. I'm playing devil's advocate. I find like this interesting because we're gauging perspectives, and like obviously everyone's perspective is going to be different, but having that conversation specifically I think is important because, I mean, for example, the half of the reason I would say that Mashari was banned was primarily because she gatekept new design space for summons, in that every time you develop a summon you have to consider the value that she as a forward is going to particularly give those summons, and thus that is particularly problemsome because it means if they print something better than Sildra, then Mashuri would abuse it. If they built, I don't know, a forward that worked with summons like, I don't know, Seymour, that used, summons to a better degree than him, Mashuri would also help him abuse that. And like that particularly is probably why Mashuri was banned. Not so much that she created unfun play. That consistency of design space would be somewhat limited. The same with Tilka, is that if they print forwards that are cheaper that activate backups, Tilka will get worse, and it'll get stronger, and it'll become worse to play against. And with cards like Zidane, the 2 CP Zidane, that exiles a card, that card will get even more degenerate. And like, it's one thing to say, okay, at least I lost through combat, but it's another thing to say, like, I didn't get to play at all because my opponent activated an infinite combo. That doesn't feel inherently or Final Fantasy. That feels almost like Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, and well, I can agree with that. I personally know about the Infinite Loop because I've seen it. I haven't seen it in play in major tournaments, but I have seen it basically created and mentioned a few times, so I know of it. But locals in Kingston or whatnot, we haven't come across it much at all. We came across soft loops, but not infinites. So when
is that less of a problem though? Because it's like, to put in an analogy, just because housing prices, like just because people build more houses, doesn't mean that housing prices change. Like, it's still expensive to buy a house, but just because you build more houses doesn't change the fact that they're still expensive.
Yeah.
So who is it helping by building more houses? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like Tilka allows for more infinite loops to be built. But just because you print more cards that work with the loop, or might unintentionally work with the loop, does that mean that Tilka is like helping anyone by it being there? Like, what is Tilka's benefit for it being in the format?
That's kind of
like, you have to in order for like houses to be bought, especially if they're expensive, you have to change other things. Like, you have to give higher wages, you have to make loan application processes for those houses to be more available to people whose income isn't particularly as high. So likewise in Final Fantasy, in order for a deck to be viable, you need to make sure that there are things that aren't going to inhibit it from being able to be played. And by allowing cards like Tilka that actually create infinite combos, you're essentially saying all of this design space that we built is meaningless once this loop becomes even more viable. So like, who are we helping by keeping this card?
Yes. That is a good point. I mean, I haven't seen the results of people locally playing against the Infinite Loop because no one's really played it. But I can see on Devil's Advocate and whatnot.
Yeah, just because it doesn't affect particularly the locals that half of the reason that this podcast is interesting is because we have like multiple instances of we have different regions in which we're all from, and we also have different perspectives of how like our locals play. But at the same time, like just because it doesn't affect one group doesn't mean it's not affecting other groups. Like, I'm sure there are locals, I mean, even in the States here, we have players that do show up with loop decks, and they do sit down, and unless you've played against the loop deck before, and you understand the intricacies of how it works, and your deck is either in fire or earth, the loop decks primarily run rampant against colors that are disproportionately equipped to deal with those decks. So like ice decks have a horrible time dealing with them. Mono Earth particularly can deal with it, but it's very difficult to do so. Lightning, poor Lightning. I mean, Lightning decks, they need a whole revamp in order to particularly keep up. So like, I feel for those particular players who enjoy those elements, enjoy those cards that are within those colors, and then they, unfortunately won't be able to play them because of the viability of these loops that will, start to exist.
Yeah. I mean, we can I can see a lot of stuff. And we can technically keep obviously talk about the topic in a lot more length, but we should probably go on
Hmm.
to other topics because this could be
No, that's
this
understandable.
could be very lengthy.
So on that same vein, Meepo was talking about like what Lightning would need to keep up, what Lightning would need to interact, right?
Mm.
So, now that we've established that loop decks are hard to play against and they're difficult and somewhat unfun, in order for certain elements to keep up, they need tools. So, it's probably not, a secret that Ice and Lightning lack some decent removal and or interaction. Not so much lightning and removal, but they require cards that keep them in the format competitively. Because we don't see many lightning decks, in top 8. We don't see many ice decks in top 8. So what particularly? I mean, I asked Meepo this question earlier, but I'll field the question to you, Digger, and Yuki. Particularly, what do you think those elements need to be viable? Like, are we talking like an update of mechanics, like making it so that ice does something new, or lightning does something new, or an expansion on those mechanics? What do you think they need?
I'm not sure. I mean, for lightning, I could see a little bit more recursion from
Yeah.
the break because there's kind of very little that interacts generically. So
Okay, so what do we have now in lightning that allows you to interact with the break zone?
a sage backup,
Zemus.
the four Zemus that but only interacts with lightning forwards.
Ah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. There's the Chadley, which only does it twice, and he does it with a forward. There's a sage. I don't know what else, to be honest.
Okay. I mean, how about from the perspective of tutoring? Do you ever feel like, I don't know, Lightning has a dismal amount of cards that actually tutor key cards.
Yeah.
What particularly would you like to see from Lightning backup wise? Like, what do you think Lightning needs on their backup line in order for them to be competitive? Because like, if we're thinking about mono water, water has Yuna that like reduces all the costs of water summons. So what would Lightning need in order to keep up with a card like that?
Probably something that could search any lightning forward, except for because right now all I see for lightning in general can only search for dragoons.
There is a lightning backup that's searching for a lightning four, but it's a four-cost
Oh,
backup.
that's Aldo.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I've seen him played primarily though in the Kingsglaive King deck type deal.
So let's talk about an archetype like Kingsglaive that like needs devotion, like it needs a lot of Kingsglaive cards. Kingsglaive's backups notoriously don't really tutor each other, correct?
No, and if they do, it's very select cards that do it.
So then, on turns in which, for example, your opponent is playing Yuna, plays Mashri, casts Sildra for 2 CP, how is Lightning keeping up? Like, what would Lightning need to keep up?
Probably a reduction of certain abilities. Oh, I don't know if you
Yeah,
guys are
yeah.
looking at the stream chatter or not.
Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't looked at it at all.
Oof. But yeah, no, it's reduction of abilities or boards or otherwise for lightning would be kind of needed.
Okay, so like, are we talking like reduce the cost of like a forward entering the field?
Something to that effect, or maybe um Um, I think lightning is kind of like in terms of magic, it's kind of like black, where it's kind of more kill spelly.
Weirdly enough, I want to say that lightning is really decently powerful when Stern wasn't there, because Stern actually gave you like a chance to Stern. Lightning, like your demons and stuff like that, just fell off the face of the earth because they lost their power.
Hmm. So then, how do you make a fairer, I mean, like a more honest sternly onus for lightning?
Well, I mean, I guess with one thing with lightning is you have a lot of hasty bodies that can go in and attack. So like you start introducing more fours that could have the ability to gain brave maybe or first strike, those kind of things. So that
Reduction.
yeah, or reduction to their cost or anything like that. So that basically when they do become hasty and they do start attacking, they have some way of being like, okay, I'm not just going to attack with three guys. Now I'm open up to get like pummeled.
Hmm. Okay, so like increase their potential for tempo, so like better tempo.
Yeah, because
So how
it's
do
like
we? So how would we design that? Like if this is kind of an interesting thought experiment. Hmm, how would we design a lightning card for lightning? Like what would we give it?
hmm, maybe because a lot of cards from other colors have a lot of don't break effects to give the advantage to what they need,
Hmm.
but the lightning doesn't really have that. It's either uh 4 or 5 costs, or maybe a 3 cost ETB, 2 costs at the minimum, or if there is a 1 or 2 cost, it's ETB or just puts itself into the breaks and to do the effect, and then it kind of doesn't do anything after that. So
Yeah,
it's
and like and lightning's problem in the past was everything that you could do damage to always had to be an active forward, which you know is such limiting the element. Like they gotta stop taking away like only activates like they gotta take away the fact that you can only target active forwards. It should just be no matter the forward whether it's doll or active, you should be able to do a certain amount of damage to.
there's very little cards in lightning that do that. Opus 1 or 2 5 costs rare or heroic Orlando. He does on
Yeah,
attack, does 3,000 damage to all forwards, and if you pay 2, he gains haste, but that means you're paying 7 for him to get the haste and all that stuff, right? So
yeah, exactly. Like for example, I think it's the Rude backup from back in the day.
yeah,
Um, he had a cool S ability. I think it was a Grand Spark. But once again, the problem with Grand Spark is you're paying 3 lightning, 4 of anything, and a rude card. It does 8,000 damage across the board, but it only hits active forwards. So like that's just such a costly thing just to be able to do like that kind of effect.
yeah. And I know for Orlando, he's a 5 cost 7K, so in terms of survivability, he's a little underwhelming.
Hmm.
Even if you happen to give him haste, and it's like you would declare attack with him before the attack does anything, then it's okay, kill him. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
And
Hmm.
even
Okay.
then, there's like cards like Kuchaspel and whatnot. It's like, oh, you want to deal damage? Yeah, no. So,
Like, if you want to make a balanced version
not
of
Kuchaspel,
Stern,
sorry, Moonwoo, sorry, my bad.
if you want to make a
Yeah,
balanced
yeah.
version, reduction is power, and use like the new Yuna that we got from the anniversary. Have them as a tap effect instead of banish the card to get the effects. Like tap them. That way
Hmm.
you can't choose more than one at that time.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah.
So we're talking about like more control for lightning then, like more abilities that allow you to interact, right? Is that
And
is that the route that we're going down?
Pretty much.
yeah, and plus, it makes things a little bit cheaper and more versatile to keep doing effects and
Hmm.
whatnot.
I
Okay.
understand that banishing three cards like Forge with the current term does this multiple effects, but when you do that, that yes can get out of hand because lightning is primarily like fire or hail with more beefy guys coming in and smacking you, while you can do it like roughly. Oh, they cost cheap less. Cool. Let's instead of having to banish three forwards to gain these effects, have them where you can just tap shit. You choose one of those effects.
Like I
But
look at
should we be designing cards to like not be broken, or should we be designing them to like help their element?
Hmm.
Pretty much both, because no matter how hard you do it, like for Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh, the
Hmm.
R&D for making the cards, they don't really think about the fuller sense half the time for playtesting. There's times that we print a card that
Yeah.
has to be banned, like Upstart was so broken it was being played in literally every single deck, to the point where
Yeah.
you banish 3, destroy a creature, banish 3, gain power, do dodge,
Yeah.
banish 3, do something else.
Yeah, but Dredge was naturally degenerate in Magic to begin with as well. So, I mean, I'm wondering how Lightning, for example, because we
Oh,
were
wait.
talking about like things that particularly can uh, like keep up for Lightning. I'm wondering like at what point does Lightning need such a power push? Like, and how do we give it to them? Like, do we worry about what's fair for Lightning, or do we just give them what they need? Because they, honestly, they have so very little at this point.
They do have very little, kind of, because even if you make a card like Lightning, it'll probably be used in something else, unfortunately.
Mm,
yeah, yeah,
that's fair. Yeah.
Hence the reason why I said, like, if they wanted a better Stern, like, an improvement on Stern balancing, that's pretty much how I said if they could make it balanced, it would actually, everyone would still probably play him. It's just
Mm,
maybe more in the line that he's actually not as broken as he was.
yeah,
mm,
definitely.
interesting.
Like I look at the lid
Right.
backup from Opus 8, for
Um.
example.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Apparently, some of the people in the chat can only hear me and Quinn right now.
Oh, that's weird.
Hmm.
Can you guys hear me?
Uh.
I
Huh.
can hear you.
Yeah, no, we can hear you, but for whatever reason the stream isn't getting it, even though on my end it's getting the voices. So, huh.
Oh, that's so weird.
Sounds like people need to start talking to themselves before
For almost an hour.
Well, it's only
Oh
recent.
no.
It was only recent though, so.
an argument going for yourself. I am just
It was just
Well.
recently though, so it's not fully.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah. I don't know. Hopefully that gets resolved. Um.
That's weird because it shows
So.
the voices on my end.
Yeah.
Yeah, it shows Meepo and all that, so that's weird. Hmm. Yeah, I'll try to fill with this. This is weird. Should have actually been picks up my voice, picks up everyone else's voice in the program here. So why is it being dumb? Oh no. There
Well,
is a
this
little
is
bit
a
of
good
music.
first lesson.
Yeah, there is a bit of music in the background, but that's about it. That's just to kind of fill the void a little bit. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Why is it? That's weird. Um, huh. Yeah, I'll just do something quickly. Picks up those technical difficulties.
That
Please,
happens.
please stand by.
So, Meepo, on that same vein, what do you think Ice needs?
Well, I find ice is slightly getting better now because with ice back in the day, the only thing you could dull and or freeze was only forwards. But now with ice, you can start hitting characters as well.
Hmm.
So like I think ice has gotten the evolution that it needed. Like, rather than just doing forwards now, ice can hit everything on the field except for obviously summons.
Hmm.
And
Oh,
and other than that, just I think they've gotten a little bit better with their discarding as well too, or
Hmm.
more balance, I guess.
Okay, so like an expansion on the dull freeze mechanic, and like an expansion on like how discard works, correct?
Yeah, like if you're gonna discard or make your opponent discard, you should get little bonuses with it. But I think Ice has been kind of doing that, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I mean the new Laswell seems to be doing that pretty well. Like when he comes in, he dull freezes a character, and on swing, if a knight swings, at the end of turn, your opponent discards a card. I mean that's a pretty powerful effect. So
Yeah, and the nice thing about Laswell effect is it's not limited to ice. Like Laswell doesn't say if an ice forward does it or if an ice knight does it. It's just only for knights, which it's great. Like it's not limiting itself to its element.
yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I just, for me, as someone who you know, I used to play ice like back in like Opus 5, and I feel like the only thing that I really missed in ice decks was forwards that made my opponent uh, not not think differently about their game plan, but like almost react differently to how I would play. So like, for example, when you play Laswell and he comes in and he Delph freezes, every forward that is a knight after that will proc Laswell, which makes him very threatening, which I like. But before that, we had cards like I don't know, Eldnarsh, cards like I don't know, Physalis that basically were threats, but only conditional threats, not so much based on what your deck was like putting out. Um, and I mean, I feel like Lightning does a good job of putting forwards in the game that are threatening. Like when you see a Behemoth K, you're immediately threatened by how much damage you're going to take. Like if it swings, you're doomed. If you target it, you're doomed. Um,
I do like
I
stuff
feel
like
like
that. Totally agree.
yeah, I feel
Oh,
like Ice needs more things like that. Things that say like I don't know, Ice's identity should be more like rule creating and thus creating threats more so than just like simply trying to starve your opponent. Because like discard is great, but like at certain points, discard will only get you so far against certain type of decks. Like water can just draw cards, like ton of cards. So discard does nothing against water decks. And wind doesn't really get affected by dull freeze. So if you're going up against a wind or a water deck, like ice does nothing. So ice really needs cards, in my opinion, that kind of promote threats actively. Constant, like I don't know, a card that says, um, I don't know, on target your opponent. I don't know, dull freezes a character, and that freeze can or that character cannot activate past its normal activation phase. So it like stops things like activation. Like it makes it so that even if it was frozen and you played a backup or a monster that said activate your backups, it would make it so that that backup couldn't still be activated.
Yeah, like
Or
Wind Drake, for example, says your opponent can't attack until the end of their turn or something like that.
yeah, just rule creating cards that basically say like your opponent cannot remove cards from their break zone. Like as long as this card is on the field, your opponent will never be able to interact with their break zone. That's a powerful effect. Like if you think about how powerful that is, that would turn off cards. Like a lot of Sky Pirates use Balthier to get back Pinello or some of the other two cost guys. Not being able to do that would be like super detrimental.
Well,
Making it
I like
so
I
that
like to believe I like to believe eventually this game will get to that point where there will be a card that says you can't remove or banish cards from the graveyard. Because I mean,
mm,
obviously that became a thing eventually in Yu-Gi-Oh, and there would be certain
yeah.
decks that would like Necro Valley, for example, in Yu-Gi-Oh will shut down a lot of decks because Necro Valley doesn't let you remove cards from the graveyard or something like that.
hmm Yeah. So
Yeah,
like
on top of that, Yu-Gi-Oh! Necro Valley on that one has like 15 different erratas.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, cards like that, I feel like Ice, if you gave that Ice's identity, you would see Ice particularly being almost like a anti-meta element, where it would make it so that your opponent, like, for example, Sid Randell, the 4CP Ice forward that turns off ETBs on forwards, that's like amazing design space. Because
I
it means
agree.
that, like, this game is very heavily ETB focused, and being able to control whether or not your opponent's deck gets to, I don't know, combo off in that regard would be immaculate. Like that's the kind of stuff you would love to see as like an ice player, um, or cards that make it so that uh, I don't know, your backups. I don't know. Every time you tap a backup, you dull freeze one of them. I don't know. Big boss things like I don't know Vorinclex in Magic the Gathering. Effects like that in Final Fantasy would make the control aspect of ice that much more potent. And I feel like honestly for them to like keep up, they really do need those kind of potent effects.
No, definitely, definitely. Like maybe sometimes the creators of the game are just so stuck on like, hey, this is an ice card. Let's make it do what a lot of other ice cards do, which is dull this, freeze that. I kind of get what you're saying. They need to think a little bit more outside the box and bring some new elements or some new mechanics into it or new focuses. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you think about it, wind gets like even as someone who loves playing wind, I notice how many viable cards wind gets. Like we have cards that like exile, make you discard, draw cards, bring stuff back from the graveyard, activate backups, bounce cards to hand, deal damage. I mean, we have cards that flicker. Like that's like super viable as an element. Like that's so much value all within one. But when we talk about cards like lightning, like we have some graveyard recursion, we have some break, and we have haste, and that's it. Like that's pretty much what lightning does. So like in the grand scheme of like how those elements size up next to each other, it seems very unbalanced.
Well, maybe Lightning deserves something like I don't know, like maybe Lightning deserves more cards that can break backups.
Would you make that like an archetype for them?
Not necessarily an archetype, just simply an effect that they just because right now I think most cards that break backups are only exist in Wind or Earth. Maybe it'd be nice if Lightning can get some of that too, because if Lightning is known for breaking forwards, maybe they can be known for breaking backups sometimes too. Maybe.
It'd be nice if you can discard light and darks for colorless mana.
Yeah, I thought about that sometimes too. About Light and Dark. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I will have to say though, sorry, to slightly change to the next point. Probably just like a little bit of a shout out to the local shops that do support the game. I don't know if that's something we can segue on to or not.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I'm down for that.
Oh, yeah. So we'll segue onto the shops, but there's also segue into like regionals and so on. Like the shops are hosting and everything, right?
Hmm.
So I mean, I can do my thing as a slightly a little bit longer, so I'll let Meepo and Quinn there and do theirs. So Meepo, do you want to start with yours or?
Yeah, mine would be pretty short. Basically, unfortunately, right now there is no tournament or local scene going on here in regards to the stores. But that being said, it's something that we're slowly working on again. I mean, back before COVID hit, we did have averaging around 8 or 10 players. So nothing's happening yet community-wise, but we are slowly rebuilding. We're still figuring out game plans, and eventually I'm going to be talking to Midgard Gaming here in St. John's about the prospect of opening up tournaments again because they've been super supportive about it in the past and all that kind of stuff. So nothing yet, but hopefully down the road I can deliver some good news and say that yeah, there's a tournament scene again, there's a local scene again. That's nice and strong. But that's pretty much all I got.
And I think you mentioned a couple times Quinn, but any particular shop you want to do a shout out to?
Yeah, sure. You know what? There's a couple here within. So I live within the like Pennsylvania area, um, and particularly we have like a couple of really nice shops. One of them is Computer Chess and Games. It's located in Paoli, Pennsylvania. Our group organizer He shows up in the chat every once in a while. His name is Opus Dopus. He's a wonderful guy. If you're ever in the Paoli/Philadelphia area, feel free to stop by his shop. He particularly runs events on the weekends, but he's fairly flexible. They have a good amount of product tell that they get. I believe the last time that I looked, they had some pretty up-to-date promos and a good amount of packs, and they run tournaments every once in a while. One of the tournaments that they recently ran was called the Black Waltz Series. It had a pretty decent turnout. We actually had our North American number 2 and number I don't want to miscount his placing, but we had some North American representatives that showed up. Competitive representatives, very competitive players, very good players that showed up to that shop. So the other shops that are in the area, there's Gamers Heaven. They don't particularly have a Final Fantasy scene, but some of the more big tournaments that are hosted can be or are taking place within that particular locals. I believe our Pennsylvania re-raise is happening at Gamers Heaven, and that's a pretty big spot for the competitive scene. So if you're interested, that's also in Philadelphia. If you're a little farther north, we have Gamer's Edge, which is a Stroudsburg location. They have a smaller group that's up there. They play, I believe it's Monday and sometimes on the weekends. They also have a considerable amount of product tell, good promos, really good people that particularly play in that area. They also play, a fair mix of competitive and casual. So they're fairly nice for new players in starting to build your collection. Um, we also have in New Jersey, on the edge of New Jersey, in I guess it's like Trenton/Princeton. It's like in between there. There's Greg's Games. They're locals. They're new locals. They have a fair amount of players that play there. It's a pretty competitive scene. I know the uh, runner-up for nationals plays out of that locals. Fairly nice guy, very insightful. A lot of the opinions that I've come to respect and agree with, especially for today, come particularly from him. Um, I'd say he has a very good finger on the pulse of the game. So I can keep going on. There's like at least 3 others in Pennsylvania. I mean, there's 2 in like the Pittsburgh area. I believe it's called Four Horsemen's Comics. They're really nice. I mean, a really great way of finding out about these places is via Digger's Discord. I'm sure if you watch any of his streams or any of his gameplay, you can message in those comments, and I'm sure that I'll see it in the grapevine, or Digger himself will find it and help anyone find those locals. But yeah, here in the States we have quite a few, quite a lot of product. We're not really starving when it comes to boxes or things like that. So players here in the States are more than welcome to join.
All right. Well, yeah. um,
Sorry, we get a lot of Final Fantasy play here in the States. So, I mean, that's why when I say like competitive play, it's because like a majority of the Pennsylvania scene gets people from like PA is like a weird middle spot where a lot of traffic comes in and throughout from all the states. So we
mhm.
get people from like Rochester, New York. We get people from New Jersey, Philly, Delaware, Maryland. We get a lot of people from all different types of like places. So
Makes sense.
um, yeah, so the meta in that particular area is pretty pretty strong. So when you guys are like, "Oh, I haven't seen Bismarck," I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I played against Bismarck like literally yesterday." And you're like, "Oh, I haven't played against a Mashari deck," and you're like, "Trust me, there's like more than enough of them here in PA."
Makes
Or
sense.
Soray members seems to be like almost every locals I go to. There's always a Soray member deck. So that's why I enjoy this kind of perspective. Because like I played against Loop like 3 days ago, and I had my ass completely handed to me. To the point where I mean I felt so strongly about Loop that like I had to see why other people were thinking like this deck was, I don't know, more fun or more honest than decks like Mashri. Because I mean, to me, Mashri can be dealt with. Like, it's not a hard, like, it's a hard matchup, but like, if you play against it enough and you know what how the game plan works, you can play against it. But Loop is like you just lose. So
No, I can see that.
yeah, that's why yeah. So if you're in the vicinity, by all means, reach out. There are more than enough locals to pick from.
Yeah, I know for Kingston right now, the locals for Kingston is kind of going through like a soft reboot right now.
Mm,
It's just because I've just because I've been one man armying a lot of stuff. Um, Someone decided to take charge of like the Kingston locals to try to lessen the weight off me. Like she'll run the event part. So I'm like,
mm.
so she's going to try in a different way, which is, I'm like, oh, thank God I have a little bit of weight lifted off my shoulders. Let's hope
Yeah,
it,
no,
let's,
that's
That's good to
understandable.
let's
hear.
hope it goes well. So,
Hmm.
but in terms of the shop, Action Pack Comics in Kingston, well, Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and whatnot, where the city is for Kingston smack dab in the middle between Ottawa and Toronto, uh, via geography and whatnot. Um, and there is a mini little airport too. I know for big events, if we get one or otherwise, the shop owner had a random idea because I have a connection to someone who organizes school bus drivers and all that stuff. So he's going, hey, if we have a big event, why don't we just rent a school bus and get people to pick up from like whatever airport? I'm like, if you want to pay for it, I can get you the connection. But that's another thing. But it's a decent little shop, but at the same time, they are willing to like they have basically patio set up. They can do so. Out of every shop in the city during the phase 1 and 2 reopening, when there's barely any indoor activity, we were allowed to play card games outdoors because we had a decent patio setup that blocked wind and rain.
Hmm.
Now, was it pretty? No. Was it functional? Yes. um, but even then, if they need to, they can put like 75, 80 plus people in their shop. And if not in the shop, they can get like a little tent or something like that to put outside so it works because they have
Not
the
bad.
space for it, right?
Hmm.
Um, the best way to uh, describe the owners and kind of the shop's feel is kind of like as I say, kind of like a auto body humor and auto body feel.
Hmm.
So if you're fine with that, then you're good. But
Yeah. How does it come down to like product and stuff like that? Do you
they
do you
really
notice that they're getting a good amount?
they well, we try a lot. We try to make sure we get the product and whatnot. We pre-order right when, if not the date of, to maybe a couple days after. We get sometimes after we beat the announcement of the pre-orders. To be honest, when it came to
Hmm.
Opus, but whatever. Set 17 and 18,
Hmm.
when they officially came up into the system, they said, "Yeah, we'll pre-order it." The only thing that didn't come up in the system was the pre-release kits. But they're like, "Yeah, we'll get on that." Everything else for the rest of the year is already ordered, so we have our orders in. Is whether or not we get allocated.
Mm.
Not only that, the store gets a good amount of stuff, but the problem is Featherclaw likes to buy them out half the time.
Oh goodness.
There's a reason why they cap me. They cap me at maybe three pre-release kits and two booster boxes. So that I'm like, okay. So I mean, even for the anniversary boxes, I technically got two, and I was like, and they're like, yeah, don't buy anymore. Okay.
Hmm.
But at the
Well,
same,
that being the case, I mean, like, it's good to know that if you're a Canadian player and you're looking to get products that these places do carry it, because one of the hardest parts about the game is like making sure that everybody has cards.
yep,
So if there's no product, how are you supposed to buy your cards? You either go to the secondary market or you know you travel, I guess.
yeah.
Right.
I know Xpac does also now we have someone that's also helping me with the singles. She has the physical singles done. She's just right now trying to catalog them. But
Hmm.
there's a whole bunch of singles they have. They also, well, in terms of older stuff, but we're always looking to try to get more so we can replace the other stuff that's sold, all this other stuff. They have a rarity binder, so like any high rarity cards that they have, they sell that. I'm working with them to update their website. Because once that's done, I can easily just go, okay, here's this, here's add that, add this, blah 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 blah. So,
Hmm.
and I'm also trying
So,
to get them on the official site's location, like shop location. But as far as I
hmm.
know, the Square Enix is trying to do all the stuff and try to make sure that part of the site's updated. So I'm like, ugh.
Hmm. So,
Yeah.
if people don't have cards, is there another? I mean, I obviously we know that there's another way, but is there another way people might be able to play the game with us?
Like in terms of in person or
Oh no, I was going to say, a great way of practicing is joining your
oh,
online feast tournament. Why don't you give a little bit of dialogue on that?
true enough. So the feast is kind of like it's a title kind of like quote unquote borrowing, but realistically, I'm just using the PvP title of from Final Fantasy 14, which can fit. Um, it's meant to be an untapped.in tournament where you just play online. All the cards are free, available, and even the spoiled cards, which you can put on there yourself or otherwise. The community's decently fast at that.
Hmm.
Wait a second. That's a thing? Online's a thing? Huh. Meet caveman. Me now learn. Me go play tournament on Friday.
Yeah, pretty much. It's usually Friday is every Friday between at the earliest 3 p.m. to like usually starts around 5 or 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Um, Now I thought about doing like a little like image of like a leaderboard thing, but I was like, eh. But we do use a program that emulates the official tournament program very well. So if people wanted to learn and practice, like how when their match is over, they talk to the TO and go blah blah blah. Here's this, and record the match results.
Hmm.
Yeah. So we also
Well, that's grand.
yeah. Other than that, there are actually a couple other shops that do hold products in close by to Kingston or otherwise. One shop that um, I basically am working with a little bit is a FTB boutique, and that's in Gatineau,
Hmm.
Quebec Gatineau, sorry.
That's not nearby. That's 3 hours.
Yeah, but it's still. And then there's another one that's an hour away. That's called Sequence Gaming.
Oh, I was further than that. I thought you were going to put
Hmm.
it down there.
And if people wanted to get in contact with you, how would they do so?
Um, Either through if they want get in contact with me through my personal, it's Digger Darkwing.
Oh, he's going to hold up Yuki.
Yeah. Uh, or they can get a hold of Yuki on Discord. They can get a hold of me if they have any questions for the OSS, so Ontario Seasonal Series.
Hmm.
They can contact the Facebook page, but that's also kind of like a whoop segue into that. um,
Got
the action pack is the one that hosts it. It used to kind of travel from shop to shop to shop, but we kind of wanted to have it right in the middle, so that way Ottawa, Quebec, Toronto, Belleville, Brockville players can just diverge in the middle, so it's not too much of a distance for either player base.
it.
So they post it every 4 times a year in person or online if we really have to. um, 4 times a year we have custom prizes like from either 3D printed trophies. This year it's plexiglass trophies because the guy that did the 3D printing, the printer kind of went kaput.
Oh, bummer.
So it's like, oh well, okay. Um, we also have like custom playmats with the custom art on it usually. I also each playmat's going to be updated per year with a new art. We also I just need to figure out how to get the dice again. We also have custom Final Fantasy 14 themed dice or otherwise. For like a prize, there's also promo cards. On entry, I just need to get more tote bags. On entry, you get like a decent size tote bag with our logo on it, and plus like a plexiglass like coaster and a couple of art deck dividers in the bag, or and some stickers if we get around to them. And that's just on entry. Entry currently is $25 Canadian to take part. Um, we might up it because of the times, but I'll have to discuss that with the shop. Um, Other than that, it's just generic and anyone's welcome to come in. This actually coming Saturday, is one of the top prizes is paid entry into the re-rise in Ottawa.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's
So
an awesome prize.
yeah, and I talked to the shop owner. If someone already has a ticket and they win the entry from the OSS, they can exchange the whichever entry they already have with someone else, or they can get a refund. Or so. That's the shop owner of Red Dragon. I mean, that's where that's
And
being
when he
held.
means about refund, where he's referring to the refund to the regionals price, that would be $45 for the ticket.
Seems pretty nice.
Yeah. Also, shout out to Red Dragon. So the shop owner there, he's doing quite like he's also really nice as well. What he's doing as part of the package of what you're paying entry for is, well, you pay an entry, blah blah blah, you get whatever. But part of that entry is paying for food for both the days for people to just have while they're there.
Hmm.
So those that take part, they get food. That's part of the payment.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah. I'm like, wow, you go, awesome. Yeah, and the owner of Red Dragon previously owned Sequence in Brockville, and then he moved on to Open Red Dragon. Actually, he was actually featured on the Ottawa area version of our national news as like a shop that's really done well.
Hmm. And if people wanted to come to learn Final Fantasy, how would they, what days might they be expecting to do so?
Kingston, it's mostly on Saturdays from 12 noon till 5:30 at the most. That's the time allotted before Yu-Gi-Oh starts rolling in.
Hmm. Okay.
But I know Brockville's trying to get more interest. Belleville's actually starting up with a shop. It's a small little shop, but they're starting up. It's Mario's Gaming World. They're trying to get some interest in there. Toronto has some shops that they're starting to pick up again. Right now, some. It's really select few, but I mean, if they're able to pick it up, that's great. Because I've been hearing good things about some shops in certain areas and some eh. But then again, I haven't really been up to date on some of them as of recently. So
Hmm.
I need to get up to date on that. Ottawa and Gatineau are really the only ones that are trying. Red Dragon has theirs. Gatineau has FTB Boutique, which has its own like little has its own community as well. There was a shop in Montreal or two that did events, but I don't know if they still do it or not.
Hmm. And where can people find this information if they're looking?
I know. Well, other than the websites, I know Kingston is. Well, there is a Facebook group for Canada. That's a hub for a lot of different communities around Canada.
Hmm.
Kingston's Facebook group is also a bit of a hub as well for like Ontario wise, with a little bit of Quebec and other stuff like that. There is actually a Reddit post that has all the information of Facebook groups and whatnot of every community that they've got info on. I'll have to look that up, but it shows all the groups that are listed, and you can look and see. And if there's other ones that are missing, maybe I think you can comment on the post going, "Hey, whatever, I have this group," and feel free to link it, right?
Sounds good. And then how about this podcast series? How often are you lovely people getting together to do this podcast?
Well, it's going to be every Sunday in the morning. So today. And then hopefully I'll do a Wednesday one on in the around the afternoon or the evening.
Hmm.
So that
And
way, people,
what topics can people expect to be hearing?
the topics for basically they can expect is like for the most part what locals are doing, if there's any events updating on that, any new decks that are being made, like deck lists or otherwise. It's really a really chill type of podcast, but we'll also like shoot the crap and whatnot, just kind of like have fun while talking about some stuff. I know what if I'm planning to if Wednesday fires off, we'll be able to talk about other IPs of Square Enix to hopefully put into that we hope will be put into the card game.
Yeah.
So
And again, we are not experts whatsoever. All of the commentary is just healthy dialogue that I feel like is healthy for a format such as Final Fantasy that is ever growing and ever evolving. So, I mean, if anyone was listening and it sounds like we're like we hate each other, that's not the case.
no,
Yeah, we're all good friends here. We still show up on the Friday afternoons to play online. Um, so we're just passionate people. So hopefully people will come through, hear some of what we're seeing. Maybe we'll even, I mean, I would love for some of the guys here, especially like Digger, to do some of his deck techs. Maybe we can talk about them on here because sometimes we see so many decks throughout tournament play that we forget that unique decks do exist, and Digger's Summons deck is really unique, and it'd be always awesome to talk about what people are playing.
yeah.
Quinn's good people. He's decently good. I still try to figure out how he cheats in the game.
What can I say? The RNG of the cards was with me.
RNG is strong in this one.
Yeah.
I
So
still
yeah,
think he cheats.
I think this is a good way of pretty much exploring the different perspectives. I know in Digger's online series, he has some lovely people from France and from Italy, and their perspectives and their locals might be something we touch on as well. So it'd be cool to see what everyone thinks and how they feel about the game that we all love playing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I
Yeah.
guess with that, we've almost hit the 3 hour mark. So those are still kicking around or in the chat or otherwise or have shown up. Thanks for joining and whatnot. Um,
Yeah.
I think with that,
I think
yeah,
we can safely stop there.
yeah.
How did I live for 3 hours? I'm like a I'm like a dog. Sometimes I see a squirrel and I just take off.
Hey man, this was a healthy breakfast, you know what I mean? You get up early, have
Breakfast.
some
I don't even
dialogue,
eat.
get your brain get your brain juices pumping.
Yeah. But
I've been trying to figure out how I stay away from dark humor.
No worries, no worries. We're doing grand.
Screw
Alrighty.
it.
Well,
I kind of wanted
on that
Chad Digger earlier, but that's beside the point. I mean, Feather.
on that, I think we're pretty much good. We're pretty much done.
Yeah,
Is
so-
there any closing statements we should be making, Dig?
for the most part, it's just thanks for those that listened, and thanks Glenn, Meepo, and Yuki for actually coming out and talking about all the other topics and so on. So
Yes, man. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it was a
Good to
pleasure.
be here. Prefer to be asleep sometimes, but good to help out. Oh, also, I'm very silly.
So with that, that will be it. So have a good one. Hopefully to see the rest of you on Wednesday or otherwise.
Sounds good.
Alrighty.
Take care, everyone.
Yep.